When I first walked into my husband's family home, I never expected the silence to be louder than any argument we'd ever had. The fireplace crackled in the living room, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen, and yet, I felt more like an observer than a guest, more like a stranger than a wife. His mother greeted me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and his brother looked at me as if he already knew something I didn't. I remember adjusting my scarf, pretending I wasn't trembling. My husband's voice echoed from the hallway, calling for everyone to gather, but he never once looked back to see if I was following. That was the first moment I knew I was alone, even when surrounded by his blood. And maybe, just maybe, that's where everything started. Not in the night that would change everything, but in that hollow welcome, in that house where I realized I didn't belong. Before I tell you the story of the mistake that nearly destroyed us all, tell me in the comments, have you ever walked into a room and felt completely invisible? And if so, did you ever wonder how far someone would go just to feel seen again? The house was colder than I'd imagined. Not physically, there was a fireplace and heated floors, and every window was sealed tight against the winter outside. But emotionally, spiritually, atmospherically, it felt like I'd stepped into a museum where all the exhibits were alive but forbidden to speak. We had arrived just past noon. My husband had insisted on taking the scenic route, as if winding country roads would impress me more than the family I was about to meet for the first time. I hadn't protested. I rarely did anymore. The driveway was long and lined with trees bare of leaves. The snow hadn't been shoveled, not entirely, and the car rocked slightly as we pulled up near the porch. From the moment we stepped out, I felt eyes. Not the warm curiosity of relatives eager to embrace a new family member, no. This was something else. Like being scanned for flaws. Inside, his mother stood waiting at the top of the stairs. She was thinner than I expected, with sharp features that never fully settled into a smile. Her hug was brief, a gesture more than an act, and when she pulled away, she studied me like I might break something if left unsupervised. There were other family members, too, a niece who barely looked up from her phone, an aunt in a floral blouse who greeted me with polite disinterest, and then, him. My husband's younger brother. I'd seen photos, of course. But they never captured how he carried himself. Relaxed but attentive, with the kind of grin that seemed half charmed, half charming. His handshake was warm. Too warm. His eyes met mine and didn't flinch. "I've heard a lot about you," he said, then added with a smirk, "mostly good things." It was nothing. Just a line. But the way he said it, the way he looked when he said it, made me shift my weight from one foot to the other. He noticed that, too. Lunch was served quickly, a kind of performance orchestrated by my mother-in-law, who seemed more invested in food placement than conversation. My husband sat at the head of the table, naturally. His brother sat directly across from me. Every now and then, our knees brushed under the table. I told myself it was accidental. I didn't believe myself. I tried to focus on the food. The roast was dry, the potatoes oversalted. I smiled anyway. That's what you do, isn't it? You smile, you nod, you blend in. My husband didn't say much to me during the meal. He was too busy retelling stories from his childhood, laughing louder than necessary, dominating the table like a man who'd never had to share the spotlight. He touched my hand once, absent-mindedly, when reaching for the water jug. His fingers were cold. After lunch, everyone dispersed. My husband went with his brother to the garage to check on the generator. I stayed behind to help with dishes, though the gesture was declined. "Guests don't do chores here," his mother said flatly, as if it had already been decided I'd never be anything more than that, a guest. Left alone, I wandered through the house. It was beautiful in a sterile kind of way. Antique furniture, family portraits, expensive carpets, all curated to impress. But it lacked warmth. No laughter echoing from the walls, no signs of real life. Even the books on the shelves looked untouched. Eventually, I found myself in the guest room, our room, and sat on the edge of the bed. My suitcase remained unopened. I stared at it for several minutes, wondering why I felt like unpacking would be admitting something irreversible. The sun dipped below the horizon early, as it tends to in winter. Shadows grew long and unfamiliar. Somewhere downstairs, I heard the low hum of conversation, then laughter. His laughter. Not mine. Dinner was quieter. Smaller group, fewer words. My husband had a glass of wine in one hand and his phone in the other. I asked about his work. He answered with one sentence, then asked his brother about something related to a ski trip. I stopped trying after that. Later, I excused myself. Said I was tired. No one stopped me. Upstairs, I brushed my teeth in silence. I changed into an oversized shirt and leggings, stared at my reflection for longer than necessary. My skin looked pale under the yellow light. My eyes, tired. My lips, cracked from cold or neglect, I couldn't decide which. I climbed into bed but didn't sleep. Not right away. I listened. Every creak in the hallway. Every laugh from the living room. Every footstep. At some point, I drifted off. But even in dreams, I was waiting. When I woke, the bed beside me was cold and untouched. My husband hadn't come upstairs. I listened again, but the house was silent. It wasn't sadness I felt then. Or anger. It was something more hollow. Like the dull ache of a bruise you forgot was there until you pressed on it. I got up, walked quietly to the window. Snow was falling again. Thick, soft flakes drifting without hurry. I pressed my forehead to the glass and whispered, to no one in particular, "Why am I here?" And in the silence that followed, I didn't hear an answer. But I did feel it, the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The morning light barely reached through the thick curtains when I opened my eyes. The guest room was silent, but the air felt heavy, as if something unspoken hung between the walls, waiting to be named. My body felt stiff, not from the mattress, but from the weight of my own awareness. Something had shifted the night before, and although nothing explicit had happened, I knew the atmosphere had changed between us. Downstairs, I could hear faint clinking, dishes perhaps. A kettle whistling. I wasn't sure what time it was, but the silence was different now. Not the quiet of peace, but of anticipation. I took my time getting dressed, choosing a soft gray sweater that clung to me more than I liked and dark jeans that were just a little tighter than comfort demanded. I told myself it was to feel put together, respectable. But as I pulled my hair back, I caught my reflection and didn't quite recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were alert, more alive than they had been in months. When I came downstairs, the kitchen was almost empty. Only he was there, my husband's brother, leaning against the counter, sipping from a mug. He wore a casual sweater, sleeves pushed up, and his hair was still damp from the shower. He looked at me and offered a nod, not a smile. That simple gesture, acknowledgement without expectation, disarmed me more than any charm could have. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up the pot. I nodded. My voice seemed caught somewhere between guilt and hesitation. He poured a cup and set it down in front of the chair across from him. No further words. No pressure. Just a moment suspended in neutrality. We sat in silence for several minutes. The coffee was too strong, but I didn't say anything. The heat of the ceramic against my hands grounded me. I stared out the window over the sink. The trees in the backyard were frosted white, branches hanging low under the weight of snow. He spoke first. "Did you sleep well?" I hesitated, then offered the safe response. Well enough. He nodded. Another pause. I was grateful for the stillness, and yet my thoughts raced. I didn't know what I expected from this morning: guilt, avoidance, maybe awkward small talk. But what I didn't anticipate was the sense of familiarity I felt sitting across from him. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was simple. Dangerous in its simplicity. My husband entered a few minutes later, his presence filling the room without effort. He kissed me on the temple out of habit and began rummaging through the fridge, talking about dinner plans, about the local shop that made fresh bread. I listened, nodded, responded. I was trained in this rhythm. But I noticed how the younger brother stayed silent, eyes lowered, the edge of his mug pressed gently to his lip but never quite drinking. We spent most of the morning in town. My husband wanted to show me the area where he grew up, the school he attended, the corner store where he once worked a summer job. I followed him from place to place, smiling where appropriate, inserting questions when the silence became too apparent. I wasn't trying to be distant. I was just elsewhere. Still seated in that kitchen chair, still replaying the weight of his gaze over morning coffee. That afternoon, the house became fuller. More relatives arrived, cousins, uncles, a toddler with sticky fingers and a tendency to scream. The noise was a welcome distraction, but also an overload. I excused myself and retreated to the back porch, hoping the cold air would clear my mind. He found me there, not intentionally, at least I hoped not. But when he stepped outside, he didn't act surprised to see me. "Too much inside?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm not used to so many people at once." He leaned against the railing beside me. The distance between us was appropriate, measured. Yet every breath I took felt shared. The wind pulled at my hair, and I tucked a strand behind my ear, trying to pretend my heartbeat hadn't quickened. "I used to think this porch was my escape route," he said after a while. "Whenever things got loud in there." I didn't reply. I just looked out at the woods beyond the property, the way the snow blanketed everything so completely it felt like a new world. "My brother never told us much about you," he said, still watching the trees. "But I've always been good at reading people." I turned to him then. "And what do you read in me?" He glanced at me, his expression serious but soft. "Loneliness. Intelligence. Strength. And a kind of sadness you've gotten used to hiding." I felt something catch in my throat. Not anger, not defense, just the quiet echo of truth. "We don't have to talk about it," he added. "I just thought someone should see you." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever phrased it that way before. Not my husband. Not friends. No one. We stood there for another minute, both of us staring out at the same patch of frozen ground, like we might find a map there to explain how we'd ended up in this unspoken limbo. Then, quietly, without looking at me, he said, "We should go back inside. They'll start wondering." And I knew he was right. Later that evening, after dinner had been served and the table cleared, people began settling into small groups, cards, television, soft arguments over football scores. I helped in the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to keep my hands busy. He walked in to grab a bottle of wine from the rack. We brushed past each other near the sink. Just a moment. Nothing more. But that was the second time. We kissed. And just like the first, it was quiet, brief, almost accidental in its hesitation. But it happened. And I couldn't pretend it hadn't. We didn't speak. He left the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I stayed behind, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling the weight of 1,000 unsaid things pressing down on my chest. I didn't feel thrilled. I didn't feel victorious. I felt terrified. Because the line I thought I was just imagining. I had now crossed it. The night felt longer than it should have. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the room darker than I remembered. Somewhere downstairs, the television murmured, accompanied by the occasional thud of a distant laugh. The house was alive with people, yet I felt more isolated than ever. It wasn't guilt that kept me awake, it was the crushing weight of ambiguity. I couldn't name what was happening, only that it had begun and that pretending otherwise would be a coward's escape. My husband slipped into bed sometime after midnight. His breath reeked faintly of beer, and his hands were cold when they brushed against my arm. He didn't say anything, didn't ask if I was awake. I kept my breathing steady, feigning sleep, while his settled into the rhythm of someone content and oblivious. It was almost insulting, that peace. That unawareness. By morning, I had convinced myself that yesterday's events would disappear in the fog of distraction and routine. People would leave soon, and everything would return to the manageable dullness we had perfected in our marriage. I would bury the moment in the kitchen beneath 100 small obligations, like folding laundry or organizing bills. It was just a crack, I told myself. Harmless. Contained. But that belief didn't survive breakfast. We all sat around the long wooden table, the surface now cluttered with empty plates and mugs stained with coffee rings. My husband was talking about the weather, about possibly taking a hike after lunch, and his mother was nodding with measured disapproval. Across from me, his brother remained mostly quiet, offering small contributions to the conversation with just enough timing to appear engaged. But he never once looked at me. That detail shouldn't have mattered, but it did. His silence made everything louder. My skin burned in places he hadn't touched, my mind looping through fragments of things not said. There was a pulse in the air between us, heavy and deliberate, and it grew louder each time our eyes failed to meet. I tried to leave the table early, claiming I had a call to return. No one questioned it. Not even him. In the hallway, I stood still for several seconds, waiting, though for what, I wasn't sure. I listened to the sounds behind me, chairs scraping, dishes clinking, the casual voices of a family I no longer felt part of. I walked up the stairs, each step measured, as if climbing out of one identity into another. Back in the guest room, I stared at the mirror. My face looked unchanged, but I didn't recognize the expression. Not ashamed. Not confused. Just dislocated, as if I had been quietly rearranged while I wasn't looking. The snow had started again, gentle and deliberate. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched it for a long time, letting my mind go numb. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Time had begun to stretch and fold in unnatural ways. Eventually, I heard a soft knock on the doorframe. I turned instinctively, but already knew who it was. He didn't enter. He just stood there, hand resting on the wooden frame, looking like someone who had something to say but lacked the language to say it. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not with words. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, then disappeared down the hallway. It was in that moment I realized we were both caught in a slow-moving current. Not drowning, not fighting, just drifting towards something inevitable, unsure whether to swim or let go. After lunch, most of the guests prepared to leave. The house filled with the noises of coats being zipped, boots being stomped, hugs exchanged with varying degrees of sincerity. My husband busied himself with the car, scraping ice from the windshield, carrying luggage with forced cheerfulness. I stood on the porch, watching. The snow fell more aggressively now, piling on the wooden steps, dusting the edges of the doormat. He stood beside me, his hands in his coat pockets, gaze fixed on the trees in the distance. Neither of us spoke. Words had become cumbersome. As the last car pulled away, a strange quiet fell over the house. My husband came up behind me, wrapped an arm around my waist, and kissed my cheek. "Finally, peace," he said. I smiled the way I'd been trained to, soft, automatic, unrevealing. We spent the afternoon indoors. He lit a fire, made us tea, and suggested we watch a movie. I agreed, though I couldn't tell you what we watched. I sat beside him on the couch, letting my head rest on his shoulder, while my thoughts wandered to another room, another voice, another presence that didn't belong in this picture yet refused to leave it. As the fire burned lower and my husband dozed off, I rose quietly and went upstairs. I didn't have a plan. Just motion. I stopped outside the room where he was staying. The door was ajar. I stood there for a moment, listening to the faint rustle of paper, perhaps a book, maybe a notebook. Then silence. He knew I was there. And I knew I wouldn't enter. Not yet. Instead, I turned and walked to the hallway window. I looked out at the backyard, where the snow was now deep and untouched. The garden bench had nearly disappeared beneath it. The trees bowed under the weight, and everything looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I stood there until the cold from the glass seeped into my skin. Later that evening, while my husband prepared dinner, I took my wine and stepped out onto the back porch again. The air was biting, but I needed the distance. He joined me moments later, uninvited but expected. We stood in silence once more, both looking out into the white, pretending it was the view we came for. Then, quietly, he said, "We should be careful." I nodded. I didn't ask what he meant. We both already knew. A long pause. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he added. I didn't respond. The wine in my glass trembled slightly as the wind brushed past. We stood there until the cold pushed us back inside. Nothing more happened that night. But everything had already begun. By morning, the house felt strangely hollow. There was no real emptiness, not in a physical sense. Every room still held its usual furniture, the kitchen was still cluttered with mugs and forgotten crumbs, and the hallway carried the scent of burnt coffee and pine from a too-strong candle. But something had shifted. The energy had changed. People had left, yes, but what remained was not peace. It was pressure. The kind of pressure that comes from something that hasn't yet been spoken but has already begun to shape everything around it. I lingered in bed longer than usual. My husband had gone out early to pick up something from the town store, a forgotten ingredient, an excuse, maybe both. I didn't ask many questions anymore. It had become our quiet agreement: the less we probed, the smoother the hours passed. I eventually dressed, not in haste, but deliberately. The fabric of my sweater clung too tightly to my arms, and I spent more time than necessary adjusting the sleeves, smoothing invisible wrinkles. I stared at my reflection and tried to soften the lines on my forehead, to make my expression neutral, safe, presentable. But it wasn't working. My eyes had their own voice now, and they betrayed me every time. Downstairs, the fire had gone out. A few gray logs sat in the hearth, surrounded by pale ash. I crouched down, relit it carefully, and sat in front of the warmth it offered, even if I didn't feel warm inside. The silence of the room wrapped around me like a thin shawl. I didn't reach for a book. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat there, letting the weight of my thoughts settle, rearranging themselves into something I could carry a little longer. The creak of footsteps overhead made my body stiffen instinctively. I knew who it was. I didn't need to look up. I could feel his presence, the way certain people leave a trace in the air just by moving through it. A few seconds later, he appeared in the doorway, dressed plainly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't speak at first, and neither did I. We were both learning the value of silence, how it could say more than words and yet demand nothing in return. He stepped closer, not enough to close the distance, just enough to acknowledge that there was one. He stood there for a moment, then gestured vaguely toward the backyard. I didn't answer, but I followed. My legs moved without a conscious decision, as if they, too, had grown tired of resisting. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we crossed the porch and stepped into the untouched whiteness. The sky was low and colorless, a pale gray that pressed gently on everything below it. He led the way toward the old wooden shed at the edge of the property, a place I hadn't noticed before. It looked abandoned, or perhaps just rarely used, weathered panels, slightly crooked roof, a rusted latch on the door. He pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The air was cold but dry. The shed held old tools, a forgotten snow shovel, cracked flower pots stacked in a corner. It didn't smell of anything, which was somehow comforting. There was a bench along one wall, and we sat down, a small space between us. Neither of us said a word. I looked at my hands, at the way my fingers curled slightly in my lap, and wondered how something so still could feel so volatile. I could hear his breathing, calm but shallow. Mine matched it eventually, unwillingly. After a few minutes, he spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant. I'm leaving tonight. I nodded once, unsure how to respond. The words didn't surprise me. If anything, they confirmed what I already knew, that this moment was borrowed time. That whatever we were caught in couldn't survive outside this house. He continued. It's better this way. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him I agreed. But I also didn't say I disagreed. I just let the silence stretch out again, wrapping around us like a truth neither of us wanted to confront. And then, he looked at me. I felt it before I turned my head, his eyes on mine, steady, searching. He wasn't asking for anything. Not clarity, not answers. Just understanding. Just to be seen, one last time. We sat like that for a while, saying nothing, doing nothing, letting the space between us become both barrier and thread. When we left the shed, the snow had thickened. The footprints we had made on the way there were already fading. I stared at them for a moment, noting how quickly things disappeared if you didn't keep your eyes on them. Back at the house, my husband had returned. His car was parked in the drive, groceries half unloaded. He waved to us from the porch, his expression unreadable from a distance. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wall. He greeted me with a smile and a quick peck on the cheek, then turned to his brother, launching into a casual conversation about road conditions and weather reports. The shift was immediate, like slipping back into a costume after a long day backstage. Dinner was uneventful. The fire crackled in the living room again, the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic filled the air. We talked about plans for the week, debated over which show to watch next, shared stories that had been told a dozen times before. He was quiet but not absent. My husband, loud and enthusiastic as ever, never noticed the pauses, the glances, the words left unsaid. Or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge them. That night, after we had all said our goodnights, I lay in bed awake again. My husband slept beside me, one hand resting lightly on my arm. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing and wondered how many truths could exist in a single marriage, and how many could survive without ever being spoken. I got up and went to the hallway window. The snow had stopped. The world outside looked clean, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened at all. But I knew better. And so did he. The morning unfolded like any other. The sun slipped through the cracks in the curtains with no urgency, casting weak light on the wooden floorboards. There was no distinct sound to mark the day, no alarm, no clatter of dishes downstairs. Just the subtle shift of time moving forward, indifferent to what had been unraveling quietly within me. My husband was already up when I opened my eyes. His side of the bed was cold. I could hear the faint creak of the floor below, the low hum of his voice through the walls as he spoke on the phone, likely work-related, a scheduling conflict, or another emergency that couldn't be ignored. These were the sounds of routine, of structure, of the life we had built on foundations that now felt so fragile. I lay still for a while, letting my breath steady against the silence of the room. My thoughts moved in circles, not sharp or panicked, but looping, like the way wind circles in a field before it decides on a direction. I wanted to believe that the night before had resolved something, that the conversation in the shed had put things to rest. But nothing inside me felt still. If anything, the quiet felt louder now. I dressed slowly, choosing a thick sweater and warm socks. As I descended the stairs, the scent of brewed coffee reached me, sharp and familiar. It used to be comforting. Now it felt like another layer of the mask I had learned to wear. The kitchen was nearly empty. My husband stood at the counter, phone pressed to his ear, flipping through a stack of unopened mail. He nodded at me when our eyes met, his mouth forming a brief greeting before returning to his conversation. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table. The surface had small watermarks and faint scratches. I ran my fingers over one absent-mindedly, as if reading the history of conversations and forgotten mornings etched into the wood. Moments later, he hung up the phone and leaned against the counter. "Change of plans," he said. "We have to head back earlier than expected. I've got some things to take care of at the clinic." I nodded, unsure if I was relieved or disappointed. Maybe both. I asked how soon we needed to leave, and he shrugged, telling me early afternoon would be ideal. He suggested we pack after breakfast. I glanced toward the stairs, toward the room where his brother was still staying. The inevitability of departure suddenly felt heavier. Like the weight of a truth that would leave no trace, but still press on the chest long after it was gone. After breakfast, I busied myself with packing. I folded sweaters with mechanical precision, aligned toiletries along the edges of the bag. My husband moved through the room, grabbing chargers and books, humming softly to himself like it was just another trip. I envied that ease. I couldn't remember the last time I had moved through a moment without questioning it. By late morning, the car was mostly packed. My husband stepped out to confirm directions and check the tire pressure, and I was left alone in the living room. The fire had been extinguished, and the room felt colder than before. I sat on the couch, cup of tea in hand, and stared out the window. Snow had begun to fall again. Not heavily, but enough to blur the outlines of the trees in the distance. Everything looked soft, as though reality itself had been sanded down at the edges. He entered the room quietly. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. There was something unmistakable in the quality of the air when he was near, an awareness that didn't come from volume but presence. He stood near the doorway for a moment, then crossed to where I sat. I set my tea down carefully. "We should talk," he said. I nodded but didn't speak. He sat beside me, leaving just enough space that we weren't touching. His posture was tense, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. For a long moment, neither of us looked at the other. "This morning," he began, "I almost left without saying anything." I turned to him. His eyes were fixed on the carpet. But I couldn't. Not after everything. I felt the words settle in the space between us. They didn't feel like a confession or a plea. Just a statement of fact. One of those rare truths spoken without embellishment. I asked him what he wanted to say. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "That I'm sorry. That I knew it was wrong the moment it happened. But also, that I don't regret seeing you." "Not really." I let the silence answer for me, because I didn't trust what might come out if I spoke. Then, he turned to me. Our eyes met, and for a moment the world shrank to just that space, two people holding something too fragile to name. We kissed. It happened without build-up, without force. Just a quiet, instinctive motion, like the completion of a thought too long avoided. And when it ended, neither of us moved. We just sat there, our breaths uneven, the clock ticking too loudly in the background. He stood first. Adjusted his coat. Said he'd be gone before we were finished loading the car. I didn't stop him. I didn't follow. I just sat, letting the quiet flood over me once again. When I finally went to the car, my husband was already behind the wheel. He looked up, smiled, and asked if I was ready. I said yes. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I meant ready to leave, or ready for what came next. The drive home was uneventful in the most ordinary sense. We passed familiar stretches of road flanked by trees still dusted with the remnants of snowfall, their branches reaching toward the sky like tired hands. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't even new. It was the same quiet we'd carried for years, the same unspoken arrangement that kept us moving forward, side by side but never fully facing each other. My husband hummed along to the radio occasionally, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, relaxed in a way that felt almost cruel. I watched the lines on his face as he focused on the road. He looked older than he had a few years ago, tired, but not unhappy. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant in the overt sense. He was just unavailable in ways he didn't recognize. Emotionally efficient, like someone who loved through logistics and routines instead of presence. We stopped once for gas, another time for coffee. At each station, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the same woman I'd seen every day, but now slightly out of focus. I noticed details I never used to, creases near my mouth, a faint line between my brows. The kind of marks left not by age alone, but by holding things in. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The winter light had shifted since we left, and everything carried a faint grayness, as though the world hadn't quite woken up. We unpacked in silence. I folded coats over my arm, carried bags to the bedroom, started laundry without being asked. These were things I did automatically, and yet with each step, something in me protested. A quiet resistance, like a door inside me refusing to shut all the way. He moved through the house with practiced familiarity, opening windows, adjusting the thermostat, feeding the cat. It was strange to watch someone resume a life with such ease, while I was still stumbling over the memory of a moment I hadn't yet processed. That night, he made pasta. He asked me to choose a movie. I picked something we'd seen before, something that required no attention. We sat on the couch, a glass of wine in each of our hands, and pretended everything was exactly as it had always been. But something in me had changed. I couldn't name it yet, but it lived in the silence, in the moments when our hands almost touched and didn't, in the way my body tensed when he leaned closer, not from fear, but from the strange pressure of pretending. I excused myself early and went upstairs. I told him I was tired from the drive, and he accepted it without question. I lay in bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling as shadows moved with the streetlight outside. My thoughts were slow, thick, unwilling to form conclusions. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke, he was already gone. A note on the kitchen table said he had an early patient and that he'd be home before dinner. The routine continued. I sat at the table for a long time, drinking cold coffee, the silence of the house suddenly more noticeable than ever before. It wasn't that he wasn't here, it was that I no longer knew who I was when he wasn't. I tried to distract myself with chores. I reorganized the bookshelf, wiped down the counters, refolded towels that didn't need folding. But the ache in my chest didn't dissipate. It only settled deeper, like dust. Around midday, I opened my laptop to check my email. Most were irrelevant, newsletters, reminders, automated greetings. But one subject line made my breath catch. It was from him. Just a simple sentence, made it home. "Thank you for not saying goodbye." I stared at it for a long time, unable to move. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Not because I didn't have words, but because any word I chose would mean acknowledging something I had no right to hold on to. The message sat there, open, visible, pulsing like a wound. I eventually closed the laptop and walked away. That evening, my husband came home carrying groceries and a bottle of wine I used to love. He told me about his day, about an elderly patient who forgot her appointment, about a nurse who'd mixed up prescriptions. I nodded in all the right places. I asked questions. I smiled. But something in my responses felt foreign. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to ask. Later, as we sat down for dinner, he reached across the table and held my hand. I froze for a second before responding. His grip was warm, familiar, safe. But safe didn't mean seen. That night, after he'd fallen asleep beside me, I got up and stood by the window. I watched the street outside, the flicker of lights in other people's homes, imagining the lives unfolding behind each curtain. I wondered how many women stood at windows like mine, quietly mourning versions of themselves that no one else noticed had died. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was a deep, quiet grief, a recognition that something inside me had crossed a threshold I couldn't reverse. And I knew the consequences would come. Not as punishment, but as gravity. Because once you begin to wake up, you can't go back to sleep. Not truly. Not ever again. The days that followed blurred into one another like watercolors left too long in the rain, edges softening, colors bleeding, meaning dissolving into habit. I moved through them mechanically, speaking when spoken to, answering emails, folding laundry, cooking dinners that neither of us fully tasted. My body did all the right things, but my mind had retreated somewhere else entirely. Not far enough to lose itself, but just enough to stay quiet, to watch without reacting. I thought distance would help. I had hoped that once we returned home, away from that house, away from him, whatever had happened would fade, would be filed under something reckless and temporary. But instead, the absence only magnified the presence of what I was trying to forget. His silence had weight. The lack of his name in conversation, the emptiness of my inbox, the knowledge that he wasn't here, those things held more volume than the actual event itself. And yet I carried on, as I always had. I woke early. I made the bed with corners tucked and pillows fluffed. I watered the plants, answered text messages from friends, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in weeks. I even smiled while replying, as if trying to remind myself how. But beneath every interaction, a quiet ache pulsed like a bruise I refused to acknowledge. My husband didn't seem to notice the shift. Or maybe he did, but interpreted it as fatigue or seasonal mood. He was attentive in a practical way, brought home flowers, asked if I wanted to go out for dinner, reminded me of movies we'd once enjoyed. I nodded, participated, played the part. But something in me was no longer present. One night, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I heard the buzz of my phone on the counter. I glanced down. No name, just a number. An unfamiliar area code. My stomach tightened. For a moment, I stood frozen, soap still on my hands. Then I wiped them quickly, picked up the phone, and stepped into the hallway. It was a short message. No greeting. Just a sentence. I didn't leave because I wanted to. My breath caught before I could control it. I stared at the words, then locked the screen. I stood there for several minutes, the phone pressed to my chest, the cool glass absorbing the warmth of my skin. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. The next morning, I went for a walk. I told my husband I needed fresh air. He offered to come, but I declined. It wasn't about solitude, I simply didn't want company. I needed to move, to shake the static that had settled in my limbs. The air was sharp with the bite of late winter, the ground still firm underfoot. I walked aimlessly at first, past familiar houses with trimmed hedges and garden lights, past driveways where children had drawn faded chalk figures months ago. I let my mind wander, not to him exactly, but to the moment when everything had shifted. That first glance across the dinner table. The second of hesitation before the first kiss. The way guilt didn't strike immediately, but crept in slowly, like fog sliding under a door. I ended up at a small park at the edge of the neighborhood, a place I hadn't visited in years. The benches were damp, the swings motionless. I sat on one of the benches anyway, not caring that the cold seeped through my coat. I watched a squirrel dart between trees. A couple walked by with matching gloves, their hands swinging gently between them. They looked happy. Or practiced. I stayed there until the wind started to bite through my scarf. As I walked home, my phone buzzed again. I didn't check it right away. I waited until I was inside, coat hung, shoes off, house quiet. Another message. Short. Careful. I hope you're okay. That one I replied to. Please don't text me again. It wasn't anger. It wasn't dismissal. It was protection, of myself, of my marriage, of whatever was still worth holding on to. The moment I pressed send, I stared at the screen, half expecting another message. But none came. Not that day. Not the one after. I didn't know if I felt relief or loss. Maybe both. That night, my husband and I had dinner together. He made a joke about the sauce being too salty, and I laughed genuinely, not out of obligation. The sound surprised me. Afterward, we sat in the living room, reading in silence. His hand rested on the armrest near mine, close enough to touch. I glanced at him, really looked. His face was familiar in a way that made me ache. Not for what we had, but for what we'd stopped noticing. Before bed, he kissed my forehead and said he loved me. I murmured it back, then stood in the bathroom staring at myself in the mirror. My reflection wasn't remorseful. It wasn't radiant either. It was simply real, someone caught in the aftermath of something unspoken, trying to move forward without shattering. As I turned off the lights and slid into bed beside him, I thought of everything I hadn't said, everything I would never say. Some truths, I'd learned, don't need to be confessed to exist. They live in gestures, in silences, in what we choose not to remember out loud. And so I slept, not peacefully, but without resistance. Because sometimes survival isn't about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about carrying what cracked, and walking forward anyway. It started with small things. A misplaced thought. A scent. The edge of a sentence in a conversation that took me somewhere else. I would be in the middle of folding laundry, or chopping onions, and suddenly I wasn't there. I was back in the hallway of that house, or on the porch, or seated at that wooden bench in the shed. The memory didn't arrive with urgency, it drifted, like smoke curling from something still smoldering beneath ash. I tried to ignore it. I filled my days with structure. I reorganized drawers that didn't need fixing, cleaned baseboards I hadn't looked at in years, made lists of groceries we already had. I cooked elaborate meals. I volunteered for errands. I took long, winding walks and deliberately got lost so that I could focus on finding my way back instead of thinking about him. But it didn't work. There was a conversation that played over and over in my mind, something he'd said before he left. We should be careful. It wasn't dramatic or desperate. It wasn't even whispered like a secret. It was honest, flat, a statement wrapped in restraint. But I kept hearing it. Not because of what it meant for us, but because of what it revealed about me. Somewhere along the line, I had stopped being careful with my emotions, with my silence, with myself. My husband noticed that something had shifted, but he didn't push. He had never been the type to press too hard. It was one of the reasons we had lasted this long. But it was also part of the problem. He gave me space without realizing I was slowly drifting out of reach. I didn't blame him. Not entirely. One evening, I watched him through the kitchen window while he mowed the front lawn. The first signs of spring had begun to show. The grass was uneven, patches of it still yellowed from winter, but he moved through the task methodically. He always found comfort in routine. In rituals. I used to find that comforting too. Now it just made me feel peripheral. After dinner that night, he went upstairs to take a shower. I stayed behind to clean the dishes, taking my time, letting the hot water scald my hands a little more than necessary. When I finished, I poured myself a glass of wine, not because I needed it, but because I needed the illusion of change. I sat on the couch, the glass balanced between my fingers, and stared at the darkened television screen. I could see my reflection there, dim, slightly distorted, but unmistakably mine. My posture was too rigid. My eyes too tired. I looked like someone waiting for something that wouldn't arrive. And then, without warning, the grief came. It wasn't grief for what had happened, or for what hadn't. It wasn't even about him, not entirely. It was a mourning of something deeper. The woman I had been. The version of me who used to believe that contentment and stillness were the same thing. The version who thought love could be measured in clean dishes and gas tanks filled without asking. I set the glass down and buried my face in my hands. I didn't cry, not in the cinematic sense. But my body folded into itself, as though it was trying to remember how to feel without unraveling completely. Later, I climbed the stairs and found my husband already asleep. His breathing was even, steady. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of whether to climb into bed or curl up in the guest room. Not out of distance, but out of kindness. It felt cruel to lie beside him while my mind floated elsewhere. But I slid under the blanket anyway. I turned away from him, stared at the wall, and counted the seconds between his breaths. At some point, sleep found me. In the morning, I woke early. The light filtering through the blinds was gentle, and the world outside looked calm. I moved slowly, deliberately, getting dressed without turning on the lights. I brewed coffee, fed the cat, and sat at the kitchen table with my journal open in front of me. I hadn't written in months. Not properly. But now the pages didn't feel intimidating. They felt necessary. I didn't write about him. I wrote about myself. About the small fractures I had ignored. About the loneliness that had crept in not because of neglect, but because of silence. I wrote about the choices I had made and the ones I hadn't. I wrote without shame. Without defense. Without resolution. I filled 5 pages before I stopped. Later that day, I told my husband I needed to go away for a few days. Alone. He didn't ask why. He only asked if I was safe. I said I was. I packed lightly, just enough to feel untethered. I didn't book a hotel in advance. I just drove, windows down, letting the wind tangle my hair and the sun stain my arms. I took the back roads, past small towns and quiet stretches of land, until I found a place that felt quiet enough to stop. It was a small inn off the side of a country road. Nothing remarkable. But the room was clean, the bed firm, and the view overlooked a field just beginning to bloom with wildflowers. I stayed there for 2 nights. I walked. I read. I wrote more. I didn't call anyone. On the third morning, I woke before dawn, opened the window, and listened to the sounds of birds waking up. The air was crisp, clean, honest. That afternoon, I drove home. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. My husband greeted me at the door. He kissed my cheek and asked how the drive was. I told him it was good. He didn't ask what I'd done, and I didn't offer. That night, we ate dinner quietly, the way we always did. But something was different. I was no longer trying to forget. I was learning how to live beside the remembering. The return from solitude was quieter than I expected. I had imagined a kind of internal fanfare, some sense of victory or clarity for having stepped away, but instead I felt something more subtle, steadiness. I unpacked my bag slowly, folded each item with care, as though the simple act of returning home deserved its own kind of ceremony. My husband watched me from the doorway for a moment before asking if I wanted tea. I nodded, grateful for his restraint, for his willingness to give space without needing explanations. Over the next few days, life resumed, but something within me had shifted. Not in a way anyone could point to, but in the rhythm of my own awareness. I didn't speak about the trip. He didn't press. It was a quiet contract we had made a long time ago: do no harm, ask no questions. But now, I saw it differently. It wasn't just silence. It was avoidance, dressed in politeness. Each morning, I would rise before the sun, sit with my journal in the soft kitchen light, and write without censorship. Some pages were full of nothing, observations about the weather, lists of tasks. Others were raw, stripped of pretense. I wrote about what it meant to feel invisible. About how loneliness could take root even when you're sharing a bed every night. About the guilt that came not just from betrayal, but from the realization that part of you wanted something more. I never wrote his name. But he was there, in the pauses, in the way certain sentences curved away from confession. My husband had taken to asking me more questions. Not heavy ones, but small, thoughtful inquiries that revealed an awareness he hadn't shown in years. What book was I reading? Did I want to take a walk later? Should we repaint the living room? They were gestures, signals. I knew he was trying, and I met him halfway. I wanted to believe that small efforts could lead to deeper change. That after years of drifting, we might find a new kind of closeness, even if it didn't resemble the one we started with. But I also knew that healing wasn't linear. Some days, the air between us felt lighter. Others, I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing back in. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box of photographs, I found a picture from the early days of our marriage. We were on a beach, sunburnt and laughing, my head tilted toward him like a compass finding north. There was something unguarded in our expressions. Something I hadn't seen in us for a long time. I stared at it for a while before setting it aside. The next morning, I decided to go through my phone. Not for messages, I had deleted those, but for the photos I had taken during the visit. There weren't many. A blurry snapshot of the porch. A crooked shot of the snow-covered trees. A close-up of the chipped mug from the kitchen. Small details that now felt impossibly loud. I deleted them one by one, not in anger, but with deliberate grace. It wasn't about erasure. It was about permission to stop carrying what no longer served me. That evening, we sat on the couch, my husband and I, wrapped in blankets, a movie playing in the background. At some point, he reached for my hand and held it gently, as though testing whether it would still fit inside his. I let it rest there. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to know if something could grow again, not the same, but something new. He turned to me and said, "You've been quiet lately." I paused, then answered truthfully. "I've had a lot on my mind." He nodded slowly. "You want to talk about it?" I looked at him. His eyes were steady, kind, waiting. I didn't speak, but I squeezed his hand in response. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the kind of truth that lives in silence. About the weight of a single decision and the ripple it leaves behind. About the ways people can hurt each other without intent, and how forgiveness often begins long before it's spoken aloud. In the morning, I received another message. It wasn't from him. It was from a mutual acquaintance, someone from the family. Just a photo. It showed him standing outside a bookstore, smiling, holding a paper bag under one arm. He looked different. Lighter, maybe. Or simply farther away. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I closed it. I didn't save it. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood, opened the window, and let the cool air rush into the room. The scent of spring was faint but present, wet earth, fresh leaves, the soft hum of renewal. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, breathing in a life that still belonged to me, no matter how broken or mended it had become. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel lost. I felt here. Present. Still carrying it all, but finally strong enough to begin letting go. The days that followed moved without friction. There were no dramatic turns, no confrontations, no unraveling threads that needed to be pulled. Life didn't fall apart, it settled, almost imperceptibly, into a new rhythm. Mornings came with soft light and quiet movements. Evenings were spent with low conversation, small rituals, and the kind of stillness that feels earned. I didn't speak of him again, not aloud. I didn't need to. His absence had become familiar now, less a wound, more a shadow I'd learned to walk beside. The grief had softened into something bearable, like a scar that no longer stung but remained tender when touched. What surprised me most wasn't how much I thought of him, but how little I needed to. The memory no longer demanded my attention. It lived in me quietly, respectfully, and in some strange way, gently. I had feared it would define me, that it would color everything I touched, but instead it became part of the background, like an old song I still knew the lyrics to but no longer needed to sing. My husband and I began to speak more often, not about big things, but in ways that mattered. We shared observations. We noticed details. He complimented the way I arranged the bookshelves. I told him when the hydrangeas had bloomed. We moved toward each other with caution, not out of distrust, but like two people relearning a language they once spoke fluently and forgot how much they missed. One morning, while standing at the sink, I felt his arms circle around me from behind. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't apology. It was simply touch, human, familiar, warm. I leaned back slightly, allowing it. Neither of us spoke. The sun spilled across the counter, highlighting the chipped edge of the coffee mug he always used. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not out of unrest, but because my mind was full. Not with fear or guilt, but with questions. About the kind of woman I had become. About the life we had built. About what I was willing to rebuild, and what I had finally let go of. I rose from bed and moved through the dark house without turning on lights. I stepped onto the back porch, barefoot, the air still carrying the bite of early spring. I wrapped a blanket around myself and sat in the old chair we never used anymore. The garden was still, except for the faint rustling of leaves. Above me, the sky stretched vast and starless. I thought about writing again, really writing. Not just journaling, but creating something out of all this. A story, perhaps. Not about betrayal, or marriage, or even forgiveness. But about the invisible spaces between people. The silences that grow like vines. The need to be seen, not as a reflection of someone's expectations, but as something complete, flawed, and true. That idea stayed with me for weeks. Eventually, I cleared the desk in the corner of our bedroom. I bought a new notebook, one with thick paper and a soft spine. I filled the first page with a single sentence: "Not everything broken wants to be fixed, some things just want to be acknowledged." It wasn't profound. But it was mine. I didn't tell anyone I had started writing again. It felt too private, too sacred. I wrote in the early hours, before the world made its demands. I wrote slowly, without pressure. Some days I only filled a paragraph. Others, pages. I didn't write for redemption or clarity. I wrote because it was the one place where I could exist fully, without judgment. And in that space, I began to see myself more clearly. I didn't hate the woman who had kissed someone who wasn't her husband. I didn't glorify her either. I understood her. I forgave her. She had been starving for attention, for recognition, for something to remind her she was still alive. She had made a choice, a messy, human, complicated choice. And she had survived it. The more I wrote, the less I feared my own voice. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I came across an envelope I had never opened. It had been tucked inside a book, an old novel I hadn't touched in years. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. His. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling slightly. The paper inside was creased but clean. It wasn't long. It said only this: "You reminded me that silence can be beautiful. Thank you for not filling the space just to make it easier." I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't keep it on my nightstand. I placed it in a box with other things I no longer needed but wasn't ready to throw away. Because some stories don't end with closure. They end with presence. That night, as I sat across from my husband at the dinner table, I told him I had started writing again. He looked up from his plate, surprised but pleased. He asked what I was working on, and I said I wasn't sure yet. Just pages. Thoughts. Nothing specific. He reached across the table and touched my hand. "You seem lighter," he said. I smiled, because he was right. The next morning, we drove out of the city to visit his mother. The drive was long but peaceful. We listened to music, took turns choosing songs. When we arrived, she greeted us with her usual mixture of critique and affection. Nothing had changed. Except me. I didn't feel like a stranger in her house anymore. Not because I had earned her acceptance, but because I had accepted myself. After dinner, I stood in the backyard alone. The sky was deep blue, the trees swaying gently. I remembered that first night, months ago, when I had stepped out onto the porch and felt completely invisible. This time, I felt solid. Present. Whole. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I had stopped waiting for resolution to give me permission to move on. And so, here I am. Not perfect. Not forgiven in the traditional sense. But real. Still married. Still flawed. But no longer disappearing in my own story.